platforms. Hey everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you here for our virtual author event series, which we have been doing about almost a year now. And it's been a great way to stay connected with all of you, to kind of keep a tether to our audience and also reach a lot of new people. It's been pretty cool. One of the benefits of this kind of crazy year is, reaching people that are outside of Tulsa, outside of Oklahoma, never heard of Magic City Books, and just kind of, building a little bit of a new constituency for all what we're doing. We've done about 120 author virtual events in the last year or so, and all kinds of different things. And we try to create what I kind of think of as like a mixtape, where we're trying to have those, power ballads, but we also want the dance tracks, and we want to have kind of a laugh here and a cry there, and kind of create that nice ebb and flow. So we're talking about the issues that matter, but we're also having some moments to escape and have a little bit of levity as well. A lot of stuff coming up. I won't go through the whole list, but I would encourage you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com. March, April, May traditionally are always our busy season when we're doing in-person events. The virtual season is no different. I think between now and June, gosh, we have, dozens and dozens of really great events coming up. And I will say just one note, pay attention specifically to the end of May, early June. Here in Tulsa, we'll be commemorating the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And we're going to be doing a lot of programming around issues of race and different things. Example, we're going to be talking to Don Lemon from CNN, who has a new book about race coming out. We're going to be talking to all kinds of different people, fiction writers, journalists, everybody. So check out what we're doing around that time, and I hope you'll stay tuned. Couldn't be more thrilled about tonight's event. Nice to have a couple of my buddies on here, and I have had a chance to do a few events with Kevin Brockmeier. And Kevin, I guess I first got to know through his efforts at the Arkansas Book Festival, and he's one of my favorite kind of writers. He's an amazing fiction writer, but he's also this advocate for a literary community in the place where he lives, which is in Little Rock, Arkansas, and has created this kind of scene there, and brings amazing people in. And of course, this last year was different, but I always had a great chance to go there, even when I wasn't maybe partaking in that festival. I just go and visit, and you find yourself in some strange bar in Little Rock, like sitting next to like Ian Frazier having a drink or something. And, it's just this really cool scene that Kevin's created. I love that people can do, something that we've strived to do too. And I've been inspired by the work that Kevin's done in Little Rock to kind of take the literary scenes away from the coast and kind of bring them into where kind of there's this kind of collage of kind of cool spots throughout the country where you can have these kind of literary hotspots. So that's really exciting. Kevin's new book, The Ghost Variations, is a book that I think anyone who's a fan of Kevin's work, as I am, and I hope most of you are, is one of these books that we've been hotly anticipating, because nobody does kind of what Kevin does. I actually had someone come up to me not long ago and mention an event I did with Kevin years ago at a little art gallery here in Tulsa, and he was reading from his book, and there's a story within the story. We don't need to get into that. And it deals with this wonderful element of people putting letters into the ground, and his imagery, the kind of way he mixes these things. And these people told me they remember that reading. They were crying at that reading, and that book after the event, they bought that book, and it kind of remained in their heart in a really special way. And for someone to take kind of the speculative kind of, you can't call Kevin's work science fiction. You can't, it's almost like it's its own little category, because the heart behind it is kind of what makes it truly special, but he impacts people's lives. And so the Ghost Variations, of course, 100 ghost stories. We're going to get a little sampling of that tonight, is something that I think all of us in the book world have been waiting for. But I'm excited tonight because I get to watch and listen, and I don't have to moderate tonight. We're going to actually be really excited about our guest moderator, Rebecca Makkai. Rebecca is someone I've known in different capacities for quite some time, and if you don't know her work, you certainly should. She's, I think, one of our great American living short story writers, for one, and also annoyingly is one of our great novelists now too. So it's just, no one should have both those skills, I guess, but anyway, she does. And if you haven't read The Great Believers, put it on your list. It's I think one of the great American novels of this last 10 years. You know, finalist for every damn award there was, won a lot of awards, all deserved. So we're going to have both Kevin's and Rebecca's books here for sale in the chat. Make sure you do that. We're doing a special 2 for the price of 2 tonight. So just make sure you take advantage of that. And if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A, and I'll be kind of collecting those. And toward the end of our program tonight, we'll try to get to some of those and answer those. But I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Rebecca. Say thank you to Kevin for joining us, and I'm going to sit back and watch. Thank you both for being here. We're excited to have you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. I'm so excited to chat about this book. I know that we're going to start off in just a second with you reading a couple of these very short stories. We'll talk some more, you'll read a couple more, we'll talk some more, you'll read a couple more. And one of the reasons that works is this book is 100 very short, 500 word-ish, is that about right?
Roughly, yeah, 5 to 6. Yeah.
All ghost stories of one tilt or another.
Yes.
Before you read, I have a really important question for you.
Okay.
Because the only way that I have been able to describe this book to anyone is to try, and this is to your great credit, it's to try to turn your last name into an adjective and then describe the book using that adjective. My question is,
I know where you're going.
Brockmeier.
It doesn't work very well, does it? I don't like the way Brockmeierian sounds. It's ugly on the ear. Brockmeier-esque. I don't know. If you've come up with something better, please share it with me.
We could go with like Brockmovian.
Okay.
You know, that's like, you know, there are just certain countries where you're like, oh, that's the adjective. That's unusual. You know, Brockmovian, Brockmanian, maybe. We'll workshop this tonight, and by the end of the night, we'll have an answer. Anyway, I think that you reading us a couple of these would be a great way to get everyone oriented to what this book is, and it'll give us some things to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I want to say before I read anything that I'm grateful to, first of all, to Rebecca for moderating tonight's event. She's been one of my favorite writers since before she published a book. Like I read a short story she wrote called The Briefcase in, was it the New England Review, Rebecca? Or Opinion? One or the other.
That one was the New England Review.
New England Review. And I just thought it was extraordinary. I reached out to her, like I found a way to contact her just to tell her how much I loved this story, even though we had never met. It's still one of my 50 favorite stories ever by anybody. And also grateful to Magic City and to Booksmart and to Jeff for inviting me to tonight's event. It touches me to hear Jeff say that he's been inspired by the kind of scene I've tried to create in Little Rock, because I'm so jealous of what he's been able to bring to Tulsa. So anybody who is listening to us tonight from Tulsa, you have got a remarkable resource in your community, and you should celebrate him. The Ghost Variations, 100 Stories. This is the beautiful cover. I've been unusually lucky, I think, over the years with the book jackets that my publisher has designed for me. And this is indeed a sequence of 100 very short stories, all of them 2 book pages long. They were 1 manuscript page long. And they all address themselves to the idea of ghosts or ghostliness or the afterlife in one way or another. And we're going to kick off with a couple of those stories, then some questions, then a couple more that I'll arrive at randomly, and then some more questions, and then a couple to close, and then additional questions from you guys if you have any for me. So to begin with, the first story I'd like to read to you is number 80 in the book. And it's called The Ghost's Disguise. The country where he lived was full of daylight, insects, gardens, dirt, and ghosts. All his life he had heard people say, when they were ill or injured, or when the ghosts grew too plentiful, the body is the ghost's disguise. Meaning in the first case, remember that life is fleeting. And in the second, Be kind to them, for they were once like us. But to him, the creatures were a nuisance. Frequently, they congregated in the aisles of his little markets. When he shooed them out onto the street, saying, "What do you want with my vegetables, my stacks of dented cans? Go away now, please." They never answered him, only stared as ghosts do, with their wide, chalk-like eyes. Outside, ghosts clogged the air like sedge flies, and indeed, in certain lights, at sunrise and sunset, for instance, or when the sky was yellowing after a midday shower, it was hard to distinguish the one from the other. Both of them, the ghosts and the flies, were just tall blurs of dots, knitting haphazardly around inside themselves. Once, in the flexure of a certain ghost's neck, and in the way her lips seemed to brim with some mysterious smile, he thought he recognized his wife, who had died long ago following a stroke. And another time, in the modest man's hunch of a particular ghost's shoulders, he seemed to detect his favorite uncle, taken by cancer just the year before. But both were quickly engulfed in the swirling company of apparitions. His mother used to tell him about a place called the sea, where the horizon was made of shining water, and the pathways were not so crowded with spirits. But such a place, he thought, if it truly existed, lay so far away that it might as well have been the moon. To imagine that any living person had ever traveled to either one astounded him. Though he dreamed occasionally of salt waves that threw streamers of kelp across his feet, he had never ventured beyond his country's borders, feeling himself too busy when he was young and too tired now that he was old. Yet still from time to time, he caught himself thinking maybe someday. All these years and still, maybe someday. Amusing the notions his brain turned out. How few were the some days that remained to him, he thought. How many the some days that had departed. He was not yet 70 when death murmured his name. One afternoon, sweeping the last stubborn wisp of a specter from his store, he slipped to the floor and awoke without a body. Around him was a great embracing ocean of ghosts, their pale eyes alight with curiosity and affection. Their voices were like waves that beat against the ears with a whispering sound. His wife and his uncle, his mother and father, shish, shish, shish. Stand up, you're here, you're awake now, they said. There was so much to do, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Death had already come and gone. So that is one of the more gentle-hearted stories in the book. Some of them, however, are frightening, or at least I intend them to be. I decided that if I was writing a book of ghost stories and none of them were frightening and they were all gooey at the center, I would have some very disappointing readers. So I tried to write some of them that were actually horrifying. This is one of those. It's number 93, and it's called Roughly 80 Grams. In a once fashionable, but now neglected area of the city, stood a Chinese restaurant known for the ghost who haunted it. Like many ghosts, she was a creature of wild mood swings, all bitter inwardness and tortured amours. The daughter of the restaurant's hostess and its chef, she had spent a short, jilted life crying in the upstairs apartment, making sad, small animal sounds that filtered down onto the tables and bamboo partitions, audible even over the burble of the aquarium. Her agonies, her histrionics, to her mother and father, they were embarrassing. So disobedient, so American. And now, to their equal embarrassment, she was spending her afterlife inside the restaurant itself, romancing every handsome male diner between the ages of 15 and 40. As an inducement, she liked to replace the fortunes in their cookies with declarations of love. The men cracked the cookies open, expecting, say, a chance meeting opens new doors to success, and instead, in blue type on white paper, got, "Your laugh makes me feel like the grass must feel when the wind blows through it." Or, "You may think it's been extinguished, but I can see the fire in your eyes." Or, "When will you hold me in your strong sunburned arms?" Worse, her parents thought, she was becoming less affectionate over time, less lyrical, more acrid, impatient, wounded, angry, envious. "If you don't love me, why pretend?" she wrote. Or, "That girl of yours, her eye wanders." Or, "Make up your mind, because I will not wait forever." When she began terrorizing the restaurant, and not just haunting it, was a matter of some debate among the customers. Everyone agreed, though, that after she fell in love with the man who coached Pee-wee soccer in the weedy field behind the storage center, there was no turning back. Twice a week following practice, sometime around 6 o'clock, the man would come into the restaurant with his girlfriend and order the crispy fried tofu with spicy pepper salt. "I want to crawl inside your clothing with you," his fortunes always said. Or, "I want to taste the ginger of your sweat on my tongue." He found the blunt seductiveness of these messages amusing, even a little thrilling. And so when it came to it, did his girlfriend. Daffy was the word she used. But for her, each meal in the restaurant swiftly degenerated into a series of lesser mishaps. The rooster sauce would not leave the bottle for her, and then left it all at once. Water glasses toppled and spilled onto her blouse. Her food reached the table sputtering with heat, except for the soups, which were cold as slush. And slowly the fortunes in the man's cookies became more insulting. "She is not perfect. She only looks perfect. She is not good enough for you. You would not love her if her flesh were as ruined as her heart. Here, watch. I will show you." It was the night of their last meal in the restaurant, just after the check arrived, that the man's girlfriend excused herself to use the restroom. Not a minute later, her scream came. At first, the man mistook it for a train breaking, so shrill was the sound and so ragged. He had already taken his cookie from the wrapper, but was reluctant to break it open. It weighed too much. All right, so that is 2 of the stories from the Ghost Variations. Rebecca.
Okay, so that story is one that I actually had a question about.
Okay.
That story reminded me in so many ways, both of, from your earlier collections, Fable with slips of paper falling from the pockets, unless I'm mangling the title, and I believe it's a separate story that Jeff was talking about, whose name I'm forgetting, where there's the crack in the ground.
That one is called A Fable for the Living.
Thank you.
Yes.
And one of the ways that I've always read both of those stories is, you know, in the most light-handed way, as sort of a encapsulation of what the short story form can do. There are these slips of paper with these tiny messages that are passing in unpredictable ways between people, between other entities in those stories. And I'm wondering, you know, I think those fables started to emerge, you know, piecemeal in your more recent work. You know, it's not like everything, it's not as if every short story that you've published has been in this fable quality, this fable kind of telling. They were starting to come into your work. And now we have a collection that seems, although there's tremendous variety, seems largely to be in that vein of, I mean, you know, the ghost story being kind of fable, kind of folklore, certainly oral. So I would love to know the evolution, not only of this particular book, but in the, you know, do you feel as if your work has been moving in this direction for a while? Do you feel like this is a one-off and you're getting this something out of your system and what is this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm attracted to the lineage of tale telling. And it's not the only form I've been attracted to. But dating really back to my first collection, there have always been at least a handful of stories that felt to me, of course, that felt to me like fables or fairy tales. There was, now many of the stories in this book are of that type, but others are sort of like, you know, little logic puzzles or Chinese finger traps of language that like are hard. You can understand what they're doing, and then it's very hard to extract yourself from them. And the characters find themselves trapped in these puzzles sometimes and find it hard to extract themselves from it. There's an immediate lineage between a fable with slips of white paper spilling from the pockets, a fable for the living, which was the one that Jeff was describing, and the story that I just read. Like an unusually direct lineage. So A Fable for the Living was purported, it's part of the book called The Illumination, and it's embedded in a chapter about a writer who's on a tour and is reading from her book, and this is one of the pieces of that book. And I wanted that writer's material to echo my own material in a certain way. And that was the story I chose for it to echo. When it came to this book, when you're in the middle of writing a book of 100 stories, there are moments when you begin struggling for inspiration. Like, how am I going to find 100 different conceits, 100 different beginnings and endings, and very, very short middles? What I did to inspire myself when I was writing this book was take a stretch of pages, 24 of them, and at the top of each of those pages, I placed a little note for myself with the titles of the stories from my first two collections, just to see what they would inspire. And sometimes what I wrote ended up echoing that previous material. Sometimes it was just something about the title that brought something to mind. And so the title that was at the top of this story, although it's now called Roughly 80 Grams, was originally A Fable with Slips of White Paper Spilling from the Pockets. And I wanted to turn kind of the love and sympathy in that story to kind of curdled bitterness and violence in this story. So this is one of the horror stories in the book.
For sure.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about the initial, and of course the question you're all probably already sick of answering, but the initial conception of this collection, did you have stories that were accruing and they sought the form, or did you have the idea for the vessel initially and then fill the slots?
It was the vessel for me that came first, and that's often the case with my books. Usually I have a conceit of some kind, often with some sort, not necessarily fantastic, but often a fantastic element that strikes me as metaphorically potent and offering some sort of insight about the human condition. And then I know a shape or a metaphor for procedure. So for instance, The Illumination with Jeff, which Jeff mentioned earlier, my idea for that was that that's a book about what happens to the world into 6 particular characters when people who are in pain begin generating light, so that you can actually see how and how badly they're suffering. But another thing I knew about that book, in addition to that conceit, was that it would unfold in 6 barely connected segments that were all almost exactly the same length, and that were connected by another device, kind of a diary of love notes that gets passed on accidentally from one character to another. So when I say that I had a metaphor for, or like a sense of procedure in mind, in the case of that book, my idea was that because it had these 6 discrete segments that were all roughly the same length, maybe I could visualize the book as a set of transparencies, like paintings on transparencies. And so if you looked at any one of them, you would see an image. But if you stacked them on top of each other, you would see a greater image that was the product of all of these transparencies contributing their shapes and colors to one another. In the case of this book, what I knew first was that it was going to be a book of 100 very short stories. And then fairly quickly, I realized it was going to be a book of 100 ghost stories. Once I understood how many ideas were sort of magnetized to that conceit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing I want to talk about with the book itself, you referenced earlier your cover art, which is extraordinary here, but what people who don't have the book yet also need to understand is that, well, it's going to be bright in the light here. There's a distinct doodle image for every story in the book. And strong assumption that you didn't draw those yourself.
No, I'm not an illustrator.
The reason I know that is that I often ask authors to draw a picture when they sign a book. And I doubt you remember this. I asked you to draw a picture when you signed a book for me way back. And what you did was you copied the Pantheon logo.
Oh, did I?
So you were like, I don't know what to draw. So you just copied it.
All right.
So I don't think he drew these.
Well, there's something that's worth pointing out about that. Let's see if this is sharp enough for anybody to make it out.
Oh my God, I didn't
The Pantheon logo, they altered it to be a ghost for the sake of the book.
Cool.
Isn't that beautiful? Yeah.
I don't know any other book they've ever, like, I've never seen.
No, they had to get special permission to
Sure.
break the logo in that way. No, the illustrator's name is Kelly Blair. I think it's one of Random House's in-house talents. And I was delighted with what she brought to this book. I've reached out to her, and I think there's some chance that she and I will be kind of conducting an interview with each other about like what we each brought to these pages.
Nice. It's one thing I love about it is they're not comical necessarily, but there's a lightness to them. You know, they're so abstract, almost emoji-like.
Yes.
In a way that doesn't, you know, like you said, some of these stories are heavy. Some of them are disturbing. The one with the film director really freaked me out. Like there's certain ones where you're like, oh God. But then these little kind of emoji squiggles, they work with those stories as well as with some of the.
I think they do, yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe that has something to do with kind of the overarching attitude of the book. Although the stories pursue many different emotional directions, I think hovering above them all is this sense of formal play. And she brought that same sense of play to the illustrations.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, like among my habits as a writer, I usually keep a totem object of some kind on my desk when I'm working on a book. It'll be there from the beginning to the end.
Okay.
And in the case of this book, it was a 100-sided die. This is called a Zokihedron.
Whoa.
And it's a lovely little hollowed out sphere with 100 facets, hollowed out with kind of beads or grains inside, so that when you roll it, it doesn't just go rolling endlessly away like a golf ball. And my idea when I wrote the book was that when I did public events such as this, among the things I could do was roll the die and just see which story it offered up to me for reading. So I want to do that next.
Perfect.
Okay? All right.
I have certain ones I'm rooting for, but I can't control the die. So
no, neither can I. All right, number 40. I don't even know. We'll find out.
What if it is the film director one? That would be.
That's 41. It is. It's so close. All right, number 40 is called The Soldiers of the 115th Regiment.
Excellent.
Often, in their fear and excitement, the soldiers of the 115th Regiment saw the bullets flying as if in slow motion. all that metal as thick as rain in the air, yet coasting, gliding. How easy it was to imagine themselves strolling across the battlefield like tourists, brushing the tic-tac of lead from their uniforms, lost in another world. Yet among the bullets was something else that came and went almost imperceptibly. Discharges of light, both beautiful and horrifying, that cut blinding patterns into the air and then vanished with an incredible swiftness. These calligraphies of light were amazing to behold, yet also sickening somehow, abhorrent. They were only visible at all because of the way the world was barely moving, and even then for less than an instant. The soldiers were reluctant to discuss them. It seemed dangerous, sinful even, deranged. Surely only the most shameful Section 8 cases saw mazes, zigzags, and falling stars of light, making formations of art inside a barrage of gunfire. One afternoon, though, after a few rounds of liquor, the men began confessing their visions to one another. Have you ever noticed? Yes, yes, by God, I've seen them too. The second rifleman was convinced that the patterns were angels watching over the front. The machine gunner suggested that they might be maps of a kind, forecasts, tracing the paths that the bullets would follow. They reminded the mortar operator of those openings in time and space that decorated the cover of amazing stories. Doorways, he said, to Mars or to the deep past. Finally, PFC Matthew Costiel muttered something about the scientific method, and then, in notes as round as a tuba's, announced drunkenly, "Learn by doing, buddy boys, learn by doing," and set off into the bullets. No one who watched him stumbling over the field in slow motion could forget how, just before he fell, the air fractured around him, like the glaze on an old painting. Though their memories could not quite reproduce the cracks of light that had encompassed Private Costiel, some trace of the pattern must nevertheless have incised itself in the soldiers' minds. For occasionally, years later, the radio operator would see lights where they did not exist, on riverbeds, in the concrete he was pouring, in his sock drawer. Now and then, the anti-tank gunner would detect something in his wife's handwriting, or his secretary's, a strange design that emerged like a fog from behind the letters, seeping briefly into view before the paper re-inhaled it. And the artillery mechanic confounded generations of high school orchestra students with the eccentricity of his baton work, certain that with just the right sequence of gestures, he would summon the ghost of the private from the battlefield, and he would step out of the light, whole again, bringing the scent of cordite and booze to the stage. So that's a story where the ghost makes a very, very late appearance. Another thing that I was hoping to allow myself to do when I was writing this book, before I knew that I would be presenting it in a virtual format such as this, was to just kind of take a raised hand from the audience and see if anybody would be willing to give me a number between 1 and 100. And so I've opened up my view of the chat, and if anybody wants to type something in, otherwise I can turn to Rebecca and she can give me a number. 23 from Aaron Barry. Thank you, Aaron. Close that again. 23. All right. 23 is called Renewable Resources. The vice president of marketing at the major multinational petrochemical corporation is a slim man and pale yellow like a wax bean. His collar's bag at the neck and his glasses lend his face an air of earnest intelligence that he feels he does not deserve. The other vice president of marketing at the major multinational petrochemical corporation is a voluble fellow, big in the chest and shoulders, He possesses a somewhat splenetic smile that he considers, despite all evidence, his most winning feature. Their salaries are roughly commensurate, their authority roughly equal, and each of them boasts a small cadre of subordinates who attend to their every word. But the first of the two vice presidents is responsible for fuels and lubricants, the second for textiles and specialties. And this, along with the promotion for which the two of them are competing, has made steadfast foes of them. How else would it happen that, after a few too many cocktails, they are standing on a bluff of black shale, overlooking a neglected pine swamp, arguing quietly, viperously, in irritable thrusts and hisses? It is nearly 2 a.m. on the last night of the executive training retreat. All of the vice president's colleagues are, if not asleep, then at least indoors. In a moment, after the splash, several of them will wake and peer outside, but they will not notice anything awry. Not until the next work week will the secretary of the first man and the landlord of the second file a missing persons report. One of the vice presidents says non-renewable resources. The other counters with energy density. The first parries with discretionary uses, and the second retorts with new frontiers of exploitation. Then the great chalk of shale on which they are standing makes a sound like the wind clapping into a sail and drops away. At the bottom of the water, in a thick tomb of mud and seashells, beneath an 18-ton compress of rock, the two vice presidents will lie undiscovered for approximately 7 million years. The first million they will spend waiting for their ghosts to depart from their bodies. By the second, however, they will have resigned themselves to the truth that departing from bodies is not what ghosts do. From the 3rd millionth through the 7th, the two vice presidents will slowly change. Their molecules will transform, their biota will vegetate, and they will feel themselves seeping crack by crack, sideways and upward, through a half-mile layer of sediment. For a time, the swamp will have been an ocean of algae and plastic, but by the 8 millionth year, it will be a meadow of giant reeds, growing high in the fernlands and mesas. From the micro-garbage of the world, a new species will have emerged, capable as humans were, of extracting oil from the earth. Only then, when the hydrocarbons that had once been their bodies are distilled, ignited, and consumed, will the ghosts of the two vice presidents be released, dispersing into the atmosphere and thus expiring. Thank you.
One thing I
Rebecca?
want people to appreciate about these last two, besides their brilliance, is the fact that it is really hard to read aloud something you have not practiced.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you have not practiced.
I have never read either of those publicly, no. Yeah.
It's really hard.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to ask a question. I want to remind people, though, that in about 5 or 6 minutes, we'll be happy to take questions from the audience. So if you want to be, tune me out, don't tune Kevin out, and type questions into the chat that we'll get to when Jeff pops back on in a little bit. We would appreciate that. That last story brings up a question for me. Something that I really love about this collection, but that I hope you can illuminate a little bit, is that there are different rules for ghosts in different stories.
Yes.
Right? So there's not one cosmology to this book. In some cases, people don't know that they're dead, or they know that they're dead, and they're repeating, I think it's the very first story, she's repeating the same motion again and again to get something right. In this case, it takes them 1 million years for the ghost to leave the body. Can you talk a little bit about that decision, which at least, to me, it has to do with the fact that for the living, ghosts are all of those things. But can you talk about, that variety, what went into the thinking about that?
Yeah.
How you see the effect of it?
Yeah. Well, one of my working titles for the book, well, the manuscript was just boringly titled 100 Ghost Stories initially. But when I was trying to come up with something better, one of my ideas was the afterlives, plural, which had already been taken recently. Within the past few years, somebody published a book under that title. So I decided I didn't want to use it. But one of my interests when I was writing the book was just conceiving of the afterlife or of ghostliness in as many different ways as I possibly could. I don't have a firm vision of the afterlife myself. What I have are hundreds or thousands of different fantasies. I don't have a firm cosmology. I have hundreds or thousands of different fantasies. And I wanted to allow as many fantasies as possible to express themselves in this book.
Yeah.
When I was in graduate school and imagining myself writing so many books that I would someday have a collected stories, not a story collection, but like that late career, here's all the stories I wrote. My idea for a title for that book was Cosmologies, plural. Yeah. So you're on to something there. It's there we go. Yes.
I love it. Well,
yeah.
If you look, in fact, at your novels, they, I'm thinking particularly of The Brief History of the Dead, where you commit to a vision of the afterlife and get through, to every possible conclusion, versus something like The Truth About Celia, where you are playing in maybe in a similar way with bifurcation and possibility. I'm fascinated by, I'm going to see if I can form this into a vaguely articulate question. I'm not sure that I can. But I think that I would feel like the Brockmosian, go with that, canon would be poorer if we didn't have both the possibility within a collection like this for you to be 100 tentacled Regan. And the places where, like in The Brief History of the Dead, you buckle down and are following one path a very, very, very long way. Although that was a complete sentence, it still wasn't a question.
Well, I mean,
you can pretend it was.
Nonetheless, yeah, I mean, it inspires something, which is, this had never crossed my mind before, but I think it's astute of you to recognize like the distinction between The Truth About Celia and The Brief History of the Dead in terms of how they approach the act of fantasizing. And this book, in some ways, I suppose, takes the material of The Brief History of the Dead and weds it to the formal instincts of The Truth About Celia.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy to think that like maybe some part of me knew that I was doing that. Like I can't say that I set out with that mission, but I think you're right that like this book possesses both of those instincts simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the playfulness, certainly, I mean, they're both playful, but the playfulness of The Truth About Celia, where you go into a squirrel's point of view for like a paragraph or two, right?
That was,
and then we're just on to the next thing.
And then we're just back out. Yeah. That was the paragraph that my editor most wanted me to divorce from the book. She did not like the squirrel's point of view. Yeah.
Never. I use that as an example quite a lot, when I'm talking to students about omniscience and what omniscience can be and the choices we make with omniscience, because we often, we'll call it omniscient when we're just head hopping between three people. Is that omniscience? I think that's just head hopping versus a godlike, eye looking down, versus what you achieve, at least in that one chapter, of just, we can go anywhere, that fluidity, which is, I think that's one of the more extreme versions of that I've seen in a really delightful way.
Thank you. That story is a ghost story in its way.
It is.
Like the idea is that the point of view is so fluid, the story suggests, because there is a character, Celia, who is a ghost, and she keeps hopping from character to character and inhabiting their consciousness as the story unfolds. But Jeff has appeared on the screen, and I think that probably means we've got some audience questions that I should try to address. And Jeff, I'm hoping, if you don't mind, if we could, maybe about 4 minutes before we're supposed to end, like give me a chance to read one last story before we break.
Ooh,
if
like
that's okay.
an encore. That's great. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we do have a lot, some questions we'll get to. You know, one thing that I loved just personally about this book was, you know, it kind of made me, you mentioned collected stories, and I've always loved flash fiction. I've actually done some, you know, projects around that. It made me want to kind of go back and read more stuff. So like the one I always go back to is that great Lydia Davis collection, the collected stories, that big kind of FSG collection. And you know, it's just something that, I don't know. It's like I want to binge on it sometimes, you know. So let's get to a few questions. This is one, I think a couple of these can apply to both of you. So I'll start with one that I'd like to hear both of you answer. This is from one of our viewers, Aaron, who says, what's the best advice you received from a literary hero of yours? And both of you have had the chance to know, you know, a lot of amazing writers. Maybe Kevin, you could start first. I would imagine we might be going back to the Iowa Writers Workshop at some way here.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm trying to think of a specific piece of advice, because what I actually took inspiration from was just sort of the attitude that my teachers seemed to bring to the whole enterprise of writing. Like, rather than, I could offer you some advice, but I can't remember where I unearthed it. And I might do that, like if there's additional curiosity. But I'll say that two of my most valuable teachers were Frank Conroy and Marilyn Robinson, both of whom I studied with at Iowa. And they had very different approaches to writing and to teaching writing. And Frank was all about the most granular aspects of sentence making. And that very much appealed to me because I thought of myself as a sentence maker. I still do. And so I took inspiration from his willingness to dedicate entire classes simply to talking about how sentences worked or failed to work within the context of a story. Marilyn Robinson, on the other hand, was about, you know, I mean, it probably won't surprise you to hear me say she was about stories as almost a religious activity. What can the act of narrativizing tell us about what it actually means to be alive? Her kind of the seriousness and at the same time the levity that she brought to a room, like she's an extraordinary intelligence who's also very, very funny. And I think if you don't spend time in her company, it's hard to realize that because you're just overwhelmed by how smart she is. But her willingness to play about the most serious matters was inspirational to me as well.
Yeah. I can give you an actual moment. And the thing is, I think this is something that is probably obvious to everyone, but it just was the thing that I was blind to. Which is the writer David Huddle, who he's someone that most people, he's a writer's writer. People don't know him, but people who do know him adore him. But he was looking at some early stories of mine, and I was stuck in this mode, I think, of trying to represent a really limited point of view, a really limited consciousness for I don't know what kind of reasons. I think as probably an imitation of some other writers. And I think in rebellion or self-denial of the kind of family I grew up in, which was a very academic family. And he just very casually over lunch said, you know, Rebecca, you're allowed to write characters who are as smart as you, or even smarter. And that was something that had simply not occurred to me. I was writing dumb characters. Lord knows why. And that opened up that idea of like, wait, I can use these characters to figure out things I don't know yet. I can use these characters to be the smartest part of myself or a smarter part of myself because I'm using them to learn and using them to discover, rather than using them as puppets to learn things I already know. And that was groundbreaking. And I think that's, I remind him of this and he's like, I don't remember saying that to you and I don't know why I would have said that. Like, trust me, that is where my work took off. Funny.
We have a question here from Brandon who says, writing something so short that feels complete is incredibly difficult. How did you know that each of the stories was, quote, complete? That makes me think of that, famous line about, what is it? No artwork is ever finished, it's abandoned. There's that famous quote about that. But these, to me, Kevin, feel very much like you knew where they were going. Did you reverse engineer them in that way? In any sense?
Some of them required reverse engineering. Many of them, however, the conceit came kind of prepackaged with a landing point. There was even one story in the book. I'm asked every so often whether, most writers are asked, do you ever dream stories? I think because there's this sort of filmic conceit of a writer waking up in the middle of the night and scribbling something down. And that has never been the case for me. But these stories are so very short that one night I did actually dream one that's in the book. And that almost never happens for me because I don't really approach stories. The narrative element of a story is so important, but as a craftsperson, I'm not writing narratives as much as writing sentences that add up to narratives. It's very hard to dream in sentences. But one of the stories in this book, it's number 66. The title is 666. It's about the devil. I dreamed it. And I woke up knowing the entire path the story was going to follow. And I knew the opening few sentences word for word and the last few sentences word for word. And I was able to recapture them on the page. That's only ever happened to me one other time. And I wasn't able to keep it. But I dreamed a novel. I was reading the Calvino novel, the newly discovered Calvino novel. He's my favorite writer. And I was approaching it in my dream, like not the way you usually approach a dream book as sort of like a narrative atmosphere, but the way I actually approach books when I read them, which is as a long string of sentences who are making echoes off of one another. And I'm convinced that I wrote an entire Italo Calvino book in my dream. And I woke up and it was gone. Like if there was one dream in my life I could recapture, that would be the one.
I dream read all the time, where I'm quite aware that I am reading sentences, composing sentences in my sleep. They're nonsense if I wake up.
Yeah.
If I remember anything there. But I believe, what if it was really the Lost Calvino novel?
I know
it was, and you can't remember it.
Yeah, I mean, if there were any way of returning to that space and transcribing it, I'm sorry it's gone, but I got to read it. That makes me happy.
Amazing.
We have a question from Claudine who says, and this kind of speaks to what you just mentioned about number 66 and tying it in with 666. I'm curious how you went about arranging the collection since there's so many stories. Talk about the curatorial element of kind of creating a playlist.
Sure. Well, when I originally wrote the book, the stories did not have titles. They were simply numbered 1 to 100 without any section breaks. But I knew that certain numbers had insinuations. For instance, 7 is lucky. 13 is unlucky. 66 is the devil. 33 is Jesus, because that was the age at which he died. And therefore, 99 needed to be God, if you've got Jesus and the devil. 69 was sexy time. So like all of the story, some of these numbers had implications, and I made sure to wed the stories at those numbers to those implications. But many of the stories could have landed anywhere whatsoever in the book. When my editor received it, he felt that it needed an organizing principle that was more welcoming than just a long sequence from 1 to 100. So together we thought through what were the themes in the book, how might we arrange these stories? And like in order to do that, I ended up creating the final dozen pages of the book are a concordance of the book's themes, or a partial concordance of its themes. And there are sections like ghosts and heartbreak, and then a list of all the stories that qualify, or ghosts and balance, ghosts and imbalance, ghosts and the cosmos, ghosts and language, ghosts in the future, ghosts in the past, etc. So I found ways of figuring out how to organize the material while keeping those handful of stories that demanded their particular number pinned to it ultimately.
That was so delightful for me to find just today, actually, as I finally finished the book. I turning back and going, oh my God, there's this other layer now to think back on, to look back at these. It reminded me of if you've in this collection, the fact that you had arranged things according to your own rubrics was clear all along. But there's this Alice Madison novel and stories called In Case We're Separated, and you get to the end, and there's an author note that she wrote it as a sestina with the same 6 objects recurring in each story in the order of a sestina rhyme scheme.
Oh, that's lovely. I don't know that book.
Cool. Yeah, it's a great book in and of itself, but you get to the back and go, oh my God, there's this other thing there. And I think I'd love that in the back of every book. I just want some kind of revelation about its origins, some kind of, by the way, it's a Sudoku. And I felt that when I got here. Oh my God, there's more.
It's like books need that after credits scene, like in the Marvel movies, you know?
Yes.
Stinger, yeah.
Stinger, that's what it's called. So we have a question about how, we'll do a couple more and then we'll do one more story. The question is from Laura and is kind of directed at both of you and says, how has each of your writing changes, how have your writing practices changed rather during the pandemic?
But I have not been as productive as I wish I could have been. I don't understand why that is. I've had the time. I've been at home. It would seem that in a circumstance like this, writers could even benefit, and their work could benefit from the privacy that the pandemic imposes on them. But it's been difficult for me to figure out how to move on to what's next. I finally, so I've done a lot of piecemeal work, basically, over the course of the last year. I'm now kind of venturing into a new longer project. It'll be a novel. And one of the difficulties in my case was that all of the lessons that writing the Ghost Variations taught me are not lessons that can be transported easily to a novel. Like this is a book that's all about compression. And stripping every story of anything that doesn't absolutely demand its place there. And I don't know how easily I'll be able to go about writing a novel. After having finished a book that made me feel that most stories were simply far too long. Like that's the lesson this book offered to me. Rebecca.
Yeah, it's varied wildly in the past year. I have school-age kids, so the spring particularly was just a wash. But I was fortunately partway into the next novel, and then had deadlines related to that. Some of them, one of them was this past Monday, as I was just telling Kevin and Jeff in the green room. So that looming pressure has helped me greatly. But it's hard. Part of it is that I do a lot of my writing usually in coffee shops, in bars, on the road, in airports and hotels, away from my lovely children, just, kind of being alone, but also in the middle of the world. And that has not been possible. So I've been house sitting for as many people as I can possibly house sit for. Had a string of house sitting jobs, random friends of friends lined up, and I've been doing that. But
that's like the version of a residency during
this is what it is. I'd had actually a residency lined up that of course was canceled. So I've, my residencies have been in other
like an Airbnb residency kind of.
Yeah.
I want to wrap up. We have one question that I think touches on something that, Kevin, I remember one time you and I had a great conversation. I can't remember where we were, but there was a cat there that you were petting incessantly. Conversation about books, but it very quickly became a conversation about movies. And we were just talked about movies for an hour. And you love movies and you're definitely into that world. And that question is about you being a cinephile. It makes me think about this great quote. Stanley Kubrick was once asked about The Shining, and they said, what do you think about the impact of The Shining? He goes, well, I think of it as a pretty optimistic film, honestly. And they said, well, they were shocked, of course, by like, well, how is that possible? He goes, well, at its root, it's just a ghost story, and a ghost story suggests that there's something beyond this life. And to me, that's pretty optimistic, And I was like, well, that's pretty, fascinating that way. Still the scariest movie maybe ever made. But talk about, just real quick before we do the last story, movies, you talked about dreaming, that cinematic, it's just all in our head. I think it's this big mash of imagery, this aesthetic. Do movies still play a big role in your creative process? Do you love watching films? Have you missed going to the movie theater?
Yes. So I'm a member of a film club locally. We've been going for 17 years now. Every Sunday we go to a movie and then out to dinner to discuss it. I could not tell you what number we're up to at this point, but it's 600, 700, something like that. I mean, it's considerable. We have been meeting virtually every week instead, just watching a movie at our leisure at home and then spending a couple hours Zooming together on Sunday afternoons. One advantage of this is that a couple of our absent members who had moved to Italy have been able to participate again. So we see them on our computer monitors every week. I read more books than I watch movies, but I am a dedicated movie watcher. The Shining, I did not like horror movies when I was a kid. And one reason for that is that when I was 9 years old and in Cub Scouts, one Halloween, our den mother showed us The Shining. And I was already frightened of axe murderers. Like that was my thing for some reason. And so the sight of Jack Nicholson with that axe chopping down the door, for weeks I was terrified. So I grew up failing to watch many of the horror movies that people of my age have often seen. I caught up to them when I was older. But if you're curious about my taste in movies or books or albums, I've got a website. It's kevinbrockmeier.com. And there's one section of that website that's dedicated to my lists. And I've been adding to it considerably. I'm up to list number 264 right now. But there you will find a list, for instance, of my 50 favorite movies or books or albums, along with kind of more narrowly tailored lists, like a list of my 20 favorite collections of flash fiction, or my 10 favorite novels about ghosts, or my 10 favorite movies about ghosts, or my 5 favorite albums made entirely using toy instruments, or 50 great 50 great books narrated by animals. So just a great variety of lists are on that page. I could effuse about many of the movies that are on the movie list, but I don't want to take up too much time doing that.
Yeah. When you say narrated by animals, this is not like audio books. These are just books where the character is an animal.
Yeah, books that adopt an animal's point of view. That's right. I would love to hear the audiobook narrated by an animal, though.
On that note, why don't we finish with one story? What's our final story, Kevin?
Okay. All right. So I'm trying over the course of this tour never to duplicate a story, unless the die insists that I do, or unless somebody from the audience calls out a number that is a story I've already read. But I want to read a story that I haven't yet read on the tour, which is the final story in the book, number 100. And it's called The Most Terrifying Ghost Story Ever Written. The most terrifying ghost story ever written originated in an obscure pocket dialect of the Himalayas in the middle years of the 19th century. It entered the English-speaking world in 1898, when the Canadian missionary to whom it had been entrusted some 20 years earlier published a translation with L.C. Page and Company under the title The Devouring Mask of Nanki Zhang. In an afterword, the missionary noted that the stone and cedar village that had birthed the manuscript once harbored roughly 300 inhabitants, a spare dozen of whom were lettered enough to write. Though by 1895, he said, when he attempted a second visit, it had been abandoned altogether, the houses engulfed by the scree and the dirt. At first, the volume sold modestly. A 1937 screen adaptation, however, starring Louise Rayner and Frederick March, and released as A Ghost in the Hills, brought an enduring cult celebrity to the tale. It has remained in print ever since, issued by a half-dozen distinct presses, under a half-dozen disparate titles, and in a half-dozen independent, yet bizarrely matching translations. By 1960, when the book's copyright lapsed, the eldritch dramatics of its style were considered quaint, if not downright fusty. So an editor at Farrar, Straus, and Cudahy commissioned a new translation. The professor who undertook the project declined to consult the missionary's edition, working instead from a photostat of the original manuscript. No one, he claimed, was more surprised by the result than he. Every sentence, every paragraph had come out exactly the same. It seemed impossible, yet the new edition, released to much fanfare, was interchangeable with the first. Only the title differentiated it. What had been The Devouring Mask of Nanki Zhang was now, by editorial fiat, Widowman Chu and The Whisper in the Night. Since then, 5 more translations have followed, each produced without recourse to any of the earlier efforts, but identical, down to the last comma, the last subordinate clause, except for the titles: The Woodcutter and the Snow Woman, The Dark Maw of the Forest, Into My Arms, Into My Teeth, For I Will Drink Your Blood Like Water, and most recently, Why, Darling, Why? Though the translators have adopted a variety of working practices, ranging from the metaphrastic to the idiomatic, each of them has reported feeling upon turning their pen to the material, as if their intentions had been swallowed by some greater force. There may be some truth to this assertion. For the fact is that despite the book's grizzled plot and the weaknesses of its prose, it has garnered more acclaim with each new publication. Scholars have suggested that it may be the first text in history, impervious not to translation, but to change. So thank you guys. Thanks Rebecca and Jeff and Magic City and Booksmart Tulsa and everybody who participated in this from behind the scenes. I'm grateful to you. I hope you'll pick up the book.
We are so thrilled to have both of you. I want to say to everybody, if you haven't had a chance yet to get a copy of the Ghost Variations, please do so. We've got links right here. You can do that. Of course, we'd love it if you would get it from Magic City Books. Of course, we have Rebecca's books as well there. What a special thing. You know, there was a time in the world where I dreamed of a moment when people would spend Friday nights talking about books and having literary events. I'm not thrilled with how we got here, but I'm glad that we're here. And I'm glad to have spent it with you guys. So thank you so much. It was good to see both of you.
You too.
All right. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.